When my credit card was declined at 8 a.m. over a routine grocery bill, I thought it was a simple banking glitch. But when I called my father, his voice was cold, triumphant, and completely unbothered. He told me he'd canceled every single card attached to the family account to teach me a lesson, reminding me that I was trained to take orders, not manage money. He expected me to panic, break down, and crawl back to his corporate empire on my knees. Instead, I said nothing. I hung up the phone, walked out of the store, and drove straight to the bank. What my father didn't realize was that while he controlled the cards, I held the master authority over the primary trust. 3 hours later, my phone blew up with 32 missed calls, and the man who tried to ruin me was suddenly begging for my help. My name is Claire Cooper. At 27 years old, I thought I had spent enough of my life learning how to navigate my father's unpredictable temper. But nothing prepares you for the exact moment the rug gets pulled out from under your feet in broad daylight. It was 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning at our local grocery store. The cashier scanned my items, smiled, and handed me the terminal. I slid my card through, expecting the usual green confirmation screen. Instead, a harsh red beep filled the air, accompanied by bold text stating my transaction was declined. I tried again with the same result and tried 2 more cards, but every single one was declined. The line behind me began to murmur, and my cheeks burned with embarrassment. I paid with a small amount of emergency cash in my purse, carried my bags to the car, and called my father, Richard Cooper. He answered on the second ring, his voice smooth, calculated, and dripping with satisfaction. When I asked what was going on with the accounts, he told me he had every single card attached to the family corporate account canceled that morning. He said that even though I was 27, I still acted like I was entitled to his resources, adding that I was trained to follow orders in his company, not manage money, and that it was time I learned my place. He expected me to panic, break down, and beg for his forgiveness right there in the parking lot. Before I tell you what I did next, drop a comment below with the city or state you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Instead of crying, I took a deep breath, said nothing, and hung up. I started the engine and drove straight to First National Bank. Sitting in my car outside the bank, my hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My father, Richard Cooper, had built a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, but to him, our family was just another enterprise to be managed with an iron fist. For as long as I could remember, everything had to be on his terms. He treated my choices as subordinate, my career as an extension of his legacy, and my independence as a threat to his authority. When I agreed to step into his company after college, he made sure every asset, every account, and every corporate perk remained firmly tied to his master account. It was a golden leash, designed to keep me compliant while making me believe I was building a future alongside him. If I stepped out of line, he'd subtly remind me who held the purse strings. Today's stunt at the grocery store was meant to be the ultimate display of dominance, a public move to force me back into line. What my father had forgotten, however, was that he wasn't the only visionary in our family. My late mother, Eleanor, had seen his controlling nature years ago. Before she passed, she quietly set up legal safeguards, agreements and trusts that Richard had signed off on decades ago during a routine restructuring, without ever reading the fine print. He assumed those legalities were long forgotten and utterly powerless. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. I walked into the grand marble lobby of First National Bank with a steady pulse and a quiet, deliberate focus. The shift manager recognized me immediately and escorted me down the carpeted hallway to the office of Arthur Vance, the bank's senior estate manager. Arthur had managed our family's corporate accounts for over 20 years, and his eyes widened slightly in surprise as I took a seat across from his heavy oak desk. He placed his reading glasses on the desk, mentioned seeing the note on my personal card, and expressed sympathy about the inconvenience, adding that my father called early to request a complete freeze on those sub-accounts. I replied calmly that I was not there to unfreeze those credit cards, opening my leather folder and stating I was there to exercise my authority under the Eleanor Cooper Irrevocable Family Trust. Arthur froze. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a thick, leather-bound binder containing the master corporate agreements executed 15 years ago. As he flipped through the pages, I watched his face shift from mild professional courtesy to utter disbelief. I continued by explaining that my father assumed those cards were tied to his personal line, but as primary executor of my mother's estate, I held 51% of the master reserve that backstops Cooper Enterprises' daily operating capital, and that my father only had signing authority as long as I, the primary trustee, remained in agreement. I slid a pre-signed legal directive across the desk, officially revoking his signing privilege over the primary liquidity account and reassigning all corporate credit extensions directly to my sole authorization, effective immediately. Arthur stared at the paper, then looked up at me with newfound respect, noting that this would lock down all pending corporate transactions within the hour. I softly replied that I knew and asked him to process it. When I walked out of the bank into the bright morning sunshine, the air felt crisp, almost intoxicating. I opened my car door, sat in the driver's seat, and picked up my phone. The screen was completely overwhelmed with notifications, 32 missed calls in total. 24 were from my father, 6 were from his executive assistant, Karen, and 2 were from our family's corporate attorney. Alongside the calls was a barrage of frantically typed text messages, each one escalating in panic, demanding that I pick up my phone, asking what I did at First National, telling me to call immediately because of an emergency, and frantically stating that the escrow transfer was rejected. A cold, quiet smile touched my lips. My father hadn't just tried to humiliate me over a routine grocery bill. He had chosen today of all days to pull his power move. What he'd forgotten was that 2 o'clock this afternoon was the deadline for his biggest deal of the decade, a $40 million commercial real estate acquisition downtown. To lock in the contract, his firm had to wire a $5 million earnest deposit from the primary corporate liquidity account by noon. When he went to authorize the transfer, the bank system had flagged his credentials as revoked. His corporate cards were dead, his wire transfers were frozen, and the sellers were threatening to pull the contract and keep the deposit if the funds didn't clear within the hour. He had tried to cut off my life over a few $100s of groceries to teach me a lesson about control. Now, his entire legacy was grinding to a halt because he'd failed to realize who actually held the keys to the fortress. I let the phone ring one more time, placed it on the passenger seat, and slowly drove toward Cooper Enterprises headquarters. The glass elevator rose smoothly to the top floor of Cooper Enterprises, but the atmosphere inside the corporate suite was pure chaos. Executives were running between offices with stacked files, phones were ringing off the hook, and the ambient noise of panic echoed down the carpeted hallways. I pushed open the heavy double doors of my father's corner office. Richard Cooper was pacing behind his mahogany desk like a caged animal, his tie loosened and sweat glistening on his forehead. Surrounded by 2 panicked board members and the lead closing attorney, he held his phone to his ear, barking orders at someone who clearly wasn't listening. The moment he caught sight of me standing calmly in the doorway, he slammed the receiver down onto its base and demanded everyone leave immediately. The executives practically scrambled past me to exit the room, pulling the heavy wooden doors shut behind them. Richard rounded the desk, his eyes wide with a mix of fury and disbelief, asking what on earth I did at First National Bank, screaming that the escrow wire failed, his signature was invalid, and asking if I had any idea what kind of disaster I had created. I kept my posture upright and my tone measured as I took a seat across from him, telling him I didn't create a disaster, but simply exercised my legal rights as the primary trustee of Mom's estate. His face paled, the rage momentarily giving way to shock as he stammered that the trust was meant to be a tax structure and was never meant to give me anything. I interrupted quietly, pointing out that it gave me 51% of the master reserve. I reminded him that he spent years telling me I was trained to take orders, not manage money, trying to humiliate me this morning to remind me of my place. I added that while he was busy trying to control my life over a grocery bill, he completely forgot that the foundation of his entire company relies on my authority, telling him that if he wanted that escrow transfer to clear today, things were going to change. Richard gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, staring at me as if he were seeing me for the very first time. The arrogance that had defined his entire life was rapidly evaporating, replaced by the grim realization that he had no leverage left. The clock on his wall read 11:15 a.m., leaving him 45 minutes before the seller canceled the deal and seized his $5 million earnest deposit. Losing his booming command and cracking under genuine desperation, he asked what I wanted. I reached into my bag and pulled out a document drafted by my own attorney weeks ago, laying it squarely on the desk. I demanded a complete and permanent separation of my personal assets from his corporate umbrella, an immediate resignation of his oversight on my trust accounts, and a full, independent audit of Cooper Enterprises' financial management over the last 5 years. Richard stammered, asking if I was asking him to hand over the keys to his own company. I replied coldly that I was asking him to recognize that the company was built on my mother's legacy, not just his ego. I told him to sign the agreement so I could authorize the escrow wire right then, or refuse and explain to the board why he lost a $40 million acquisition because he wanted to play mind games with his daughter. He looked at the document, then at the clock, and finally at me. With trembling hands, Richard picked up his pen and signed his name across the bottom. I took the paper, checked every line, and pulled out my phone to dial Arthur Vance at First National Bank. The wire was authorized in seconds. Walking out of Cooper Enterprises that afternoon, the crisp air felt different. It felt like freedom. By standing my ground, I hadn't just saved a business deal or secured my own financial independence. I had permanently shattered the toxic cycle of control my father had used to rule our lives for decades. Richard kept his company, but the dynamics had forever changed. He could no longer hide behind posturing or use financial threats to demand compliance. For the first time, he was forced to respect the boundaries I set. I used my portion of the trust to launch an independent venture, building a career entirely on my own merits, completely free from his shadow. Sometimes, people who claim to hold all the power only have it because we forget to check what's standing beneath them. It takes courage to look past the fear, inspect the foundation, and claim what is rightfully yours. Now, I'm curious about your thoughts. If someone in your life tried to use financial leverage or manipulative tactics to control your choices, how would you have handled a situation like this? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of standing up and taking back control, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out the next video popping up on your screen right now for another incredible story. Thank you for watching.